This video covers modules 29 and 30 notes, and it's going to cover a variety of different topics, including the tragedy of the commons, clear cutting, meat production methods, impacts of mining, and sustainable forestry. We're going to start off with land use concepts and classification. So human land use is going to affect the environment in many different ways. Humans use land for agriculture, housing, recreation, industry, mining, and waste disposal. And all these things are going to have benefits to humans and drawbacks, which would be to humans and also to the environment and other organisms. And we're going to look at three things to help us understand land use: tragedy of the commons, externalities, and maximum sustainable yield. Tragedy of the commons tells us that there is a tendency of a shared limited resource to become depleted because people act from self-interest for short-term gain. So, I need this huge chunk of land so that my cattle can graze, so I'm going to overgraze this area and let everybody else deal with the consequences. More recently, the great toilet paper fiasco of 2020. People were panicky. They took more toilet paper than they needed, which left several of us without toilet paper, for quite a bit of time in early 2020. Because of this idea, lands tend to become overgrazed, overharvested, and deforested. And it was brought up by this guy named Garrett Hardin in 1968, which was quite a long time ago, but it is still an issue now. So make sure you're familiar with this idea and some examples that are not the ones that I gave. So here is a picture example of it. So use of the commons is below the carrying capacity of the land. Everybody's benefiting. The animals are happy and things like that. If one or more users increase the use of the commons beyond its carrying capacity, the commons becomes degraded and the cost of the degradation is incurred by all the users. And then we go into more issues from there. Moving on to externalities. This is the cost or benefit of a good or service that is not included in the purchase price. So let's say you go to the store and you buy chicken. Often the price of that chicken, it does not include, the space and the water and the food resources that it takes to raise that chicken until it gets to that point. The tragedy of the commons is a result of a negative externality. They can, of course, be positive, but here we're more concerned with the negative ones. As an example, a farmer grazes too many sheep in a pasture, which does more harm than it does benefit. As long as land supports grazing, the individual farmer does not pay for the harm, but it does harm the other farmers because now our land is not as happy and healthy as it could be. Now you're not going to be able to keep as many sheep in that pasture. Some possible responses to this issue would be making more land private instead of public and to have some sort of government regulation. I'm not sure how practical those things are, but they would help solve that problem. Finally, we'll look at maximum sustainable yield, which is the maximum amount of renewables that can be harvested without compromising the future availability of the resource. In other words, how much can I take without totally depleting that resource? And that amount is going to vary by resource. It is very hard to calculate. And part of that is because it can take months or years to know if a yield is actually sustainable. So maybe we're close to that or not even close. Who knows? It's going to take a while to find out. Here's a picture example. Our maximum sustainable yield is going to be at about half of the carrying capacity, but again, it's a little tricky to estimate that. Next, we're going to look at Protected lands. So there are some international categories of public lands, and those would be designated by the United Nations. And those include national parks, managed resource protected areas, habitat species management areas, strict nature reserves, protected landscapes, and national monuments. So those again are designated by the United Nations, and there are some of those categories here in the US as well. Here is a map of the world. That's the yellow represents international protected areas. Blue would be national for that country, and then green would be both. So you can see where those protected areas are around the globe. U.S. protects public lands under the categories of rangelands, national forests, national parks, wildlife refuges, and wilderness areas. And here is a specific map of the U.S. in particular. Of course, most of these areas are going to be out west. And on this map, you can also see who it is that is in charge of that protected area. Most of it's going to be the Bureau of Land Management, but there are several other places that help or are in charge of protecting that land. In the US, this is what all of our land is used for. So about a quarter is grassland and grazing land. Another quarter is for timber production. About 20% is cropland, and you can see what's left after that. It is kind of interesting that we are only using about 4%, 5 if you include defense, but for urban, residential, and transportation. It feels like by looking around that it's more than that, but I think that's just because of where we live. More than 95% of all federal lands are managed by 4 federal agencies, and those would be the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Forest Service, the National Park Service, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And there is some overlap with what they are managing, and it just kind of depends on what that area is. But you definitely want to follow their rules when you're in their space, because these guys do not play around with protecting our protected land. Land management practices will vary according to use. So depending on what the land's used for, different management techniques might need to be there. We'll start with rangelands, which are dry, open grasslands. This is the most common use of land in the United States. The 2 big issues are overgrazing and undergrazing. We want to be right at perfect grazing. When an area is experiencing overgrazing, that can lead to more land being exposed, and that will lead to more wind and water erosion. Since rangelands are mostly for grazing things, let's talk about meat production. Meat production is less efficient than agriculture, and it's going to take up to 20 times more land to produce the same amount of calories. Thinking back to where you get the most energy from, thinking back to food chains and food webs, this is just reiterating that same point. Methods for meat production include concentrated animal feeding operations, which are CAFOs, or you can call them feedlots, and free-range grazing. With CAFOs, it is the quickest way to get the product. It's going to be less expensive, so our consumer costs are going to be a little bit lower. These places are, the ones you see the pictures of on the news or in the documentary, where there's way too many animals in this really small space, because the people that own those spaces are trying to make the biggest profit, and they can do that by packing in the most animals as possible. Here, the animals are going to be fed grains or other feed that's not as good for them, maybe as grass, if we're talking about cows in particular. And these places will generate a lot of organic waste, which contaminates the groundwater and surface water in turn. With free-range grazing, we're not going to have as many of these issues. And you'll notice on some packaging maybe if you go to the grocery store, you'll see like free range chicken or whatever, grass fed beef. But the problem is those are generally going to be a little bit more expensive, and not everybody can afford that. And so as these companies are seeing like, oh, I can make a crap ton of money off of this, they're going to keep using the CAFOs as long as people will be buying them or buying their products. Back to land management practices, we're moving on to forests, which are land that's dominated by trees and other woody vegetation. And these are sometimes going to be used for commercial logging. However, 73% of forests that are used for commercial timber in the United States are going to be privately owned. And we are going to look at timber harvesting practices, logging, deforestation, and reforestation, and fire management separately because these are all issues that affect our forests. There are two types, well, really three, of timber harvesting practices. With clear cutting, they're just going to come through and take out all of the trees in a specified area. This is the easiest method of harvesting timber, and it's the most economical, meaning people can make the most money off of it. Usually they will replant after clear cutting, but the issue is that can reduce biodiversity because, we have this forest that's been there for a long time. It's got lots of animals that live in it. If you cut all that down, those animals have got to go somewhere or die. Then it's going to take a while for the replanted trees to reach maturity. One of the issues with clear cutting is that it does increase wind and water erosion because we have more land that's being exposed. With selective cutting, they're going to go in and remove like one tree or like randomly around, take a small number of trees from an area. This is going to have a less extensive environmental impact, but downside or an economic downside is you're not able to harvest as much timber and therefore not as able to make as much money. The third is an ecologically sustainable forestry, which is another approach to logging that removes trees in forests in ways that do not affect the plants and animals in the area. And here we've got some picture examples of both clear cutting on the top and selective cutting at the bottom. In general, selective cutting is going to be the way to go if we are concerned with environmental impacts. 30% of all commercial timber in the world is produced in the US and Canada. Logging does disrupt habitats, and it often will replace complex forest ecosystem with tree plantations. Tree plantations are a large area with one, maybe two species of tree that is going to grow pretty rapidly, and then all of those will be clear cut and replanted, which severely decrease biodiversity, especially if you are going to plant a tree on your tree plantation that is maybe not native to that area. Deforestation is the removal of trees or a whole forest, and reforestation is replanting what has been cut down. And I think it's important that most of the time we're talking about replanting, it is not necessarily replanting what was already there. It could be what is most convenient for whoever owns that land. Last, we'll look at fire management. In forest ecosystems, fire is important for both nutrient cycling and regeneration. There are some types of trees that their seeds will not open and start to grow until they are exposed to extreme heat. So in those areas, gotta have fire to be able to replace the trees as they get older and die. The US created an even bigger problem when they were suppressing fires instead of either letting them go or getting to a prescribed burn, which we'll look at here in a second. And when the US was largely suppressing fires, it actually led to more and larger fires because there was so much buildup of dead biomass on the forest floor that one little thing was, big spark, harder to contain. And so I am not suggesting that we do not need to contain and put out forest fires, particularly because, we don't want them to get close to residential areas. The issue is that when we do not let forests burn, something will happen and they will burn, and it will be something that we cannot control and contain. Um, a lot of what we're seeing with having more fires out west is likely a combination of fire management, and also an issue with global warming, which we'll see later in the year. What is done more so now is a prescribed burn where, okay, we're going to section off this area and go ahead and let it burn. So it does reduce the accumulation of the dead biomass on the forest floor. And with controlled burns, we can, burn areas in a cycle to make sure that they're not going to go up on their own. There is lots of federal regulation of land use, including the National Environmental Policy Act, environmental impact statements, environmental mitigation plans, and the Endangered Species Act, which you can read about on your own time. Another issue we know with land management is that residential land use is expanding. So again, that was like 4% of all the land in the US, but that number is probably getting bigger as we speak. Over the last 50 years, more people have moved from rural areas to larger cities, as you can see on figure 30.7. When we use the term suburb, we mean an area surrounding a metropolitan center that has a lower population density than the metro center does. An exurb is similar to a suburb, but it is not connected to a central city. There are lots of causes and consequences of urban sprawl. Urban sprawl is urbanized areas that spread into rural areas, removing the clear boundaries between urban and rural areas. And there are four main sources of that sprawl. One is cars and highway construction. With having more cars and more highways, it is way easier to work in the city and live outside of it, which I'm sure a lot of your families do. The other thing is living costs, because the living costs are generally going to be lower in the suburbs than they are in the city. Although, here I'm not so sure that that is necessarily true in all cases. Urban blight is the degradation of the built and social environments of the city that often accompanies and accelerates migration to the suburbs. And this historically, and still even now, does contribute to racial segregation. And then finally, government policies such as the Highway Trust Fund, induced demand zoning, and multi-use zoning. Here is the feedback loop of urban blight in figure 30.8. What we want is smart growth, which is a set of principles of community planning that focuses on strategies to encourage the development of sustainable, healthy communities. And there are 10 principles that are: create mixed land uses, create a range of housing opportunities and choices, create walkable neighborhoods, encourage community and stakeholder collaboration in development decisions, take advantage of compact building design, foster distinctive, attractive communities with a strong sense of place, preserve open space, farmland, natural beauty, and critical environmental areas, provide a variety of transportation choices, strengthen and direct development towards existing communities, and make development decisions predictable, fair, and cost effective. A thing to consider here is, we've already developed a lot of our suburban areas. Is it too late to implement smart growth? Do we need to be working towards this going forward? I'd also like for you to read this list to yourself again and think about where we live. Are there some of these principles that you see were clearly done as our town was being developed? Are there some that we can work on? Things like that. Finally, we are going to talk about mining. Rocks and minerals are finite resources. Some of those will be abundant and some are very, very rare. Crustal abundance is the average concentration of an element in Earth's crust. It's mostly made up of oxygen, silicon, aluminum, and iron, but there are some some smaller portions that are other things. Ore is concentrated accumulation of minerals from which valuable materials can be extracted, meaning we can take it out and sell it and somebody can make some money. Metals is an element with properties that allow it to conduct electricity and heat energy and to perform other important functions. So those are extracted for things that we need to live our lives the way we do. Here is a pie chart here in figure 25.11 that gives you the percentages of the abundance of ores and metals, our crustal abundance, which again is mostly those four things. This table has our approximate supplies of metal reserves that we have left, both globally and specifically in the US, which is not looking great, in my opinion. Some of these things we don't even have any reserves in the US, and the global reserves are quite low, likely within your lifetime, and that's a problem. There are different mining techniques because we can mine on the surface or below the surface. Surface mining includes strip mining, where there is a removal of strips of soil and rock to expose the ore. Open pit mining, which uses a large visible pit or hole in the ground. Mountaintop removal, where the entire top of a mountain is removed with explosives. And placer mining, where you look for minerals, metals, and precious stones in river sediments, which maybe you've done like on vacation or something, a place where you can like pan for ore and things. Subsurface mining is used when the desired resource is more than 100 meters below the Earth's surface. And when we think about mining, this is what we generally think of, where people jump on this elevator and they go really far down into the earth, and there's like tunnels and shafts and things like that. That's generally going to be used for coal, diamonds, and gold. And here are some picture examples of both surface and subsurface mining techniques in figure 25.12. You can see all of those there. Each of those types of mining is going to have effects on air, water, soil, biodiversity, and humans. So you should be familiar with those benefits and consequences.